this rubric is to think about governance in terms of authority, and especially how the locus of or source of that authority is understood. And I'm focusing here very much on not the 19th but the 20th century, but same place in Egypt. So in April of 1925, the Egyptian Muslim scholar and judge Ali Abdul Razik published a book that turned out to be something of a bombshell. Titled Islam and the Foundations of Political Power, Abdul Razik's book advanced a forthright argument for the separation between religion and state in Islam. The contemporary Egyptian writer Muhammad Imara has characterized it as the first attempt to Islamicize secularism, to claim that Islam is secular. For the views he expressed in this work, Abdul Razik met with strong opposition from his colleagues at the famed Azhar University, and in a matter of months he had been expelled from the community of ulama by the Council of Senior Scholars. Writing some 35 years later, the academic Nadav Safran commented in his study of liberal nationalist thinkers that the timing of Abdul Razik's publication, coming as it did in the wake of the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate, served to focus attention on the relevance of the institution of the Caliphate. But, Safran suggested, Abdul Razik was advancing, in fact, a more fundamental thesis. Quote, that Islam is, on the one hand, an exclusively spiritual community, and on the other, a code of disciplinary and religious precepts binding upon the individual conscience without any relation to power and politics, unquote. It is on the second of these understandings of secularism that I wish to focus my comments tonight. In particular, I want to probe the notions of individual conscience and religion and the distance from power and politics that they are thought to imply. To do so, I want to look at two very different figures in the early 20th century to think through, in a rather preliminary sort of way, the kinds of questions that were occupying Muslim Egyptian thinkers of this period, focusing specifically on an increasing emphasis on a notion of the human person as a self-governing individual capable of independent ethical evaluation. So I want to point out that both of the texts I focus on here, or that I will focus on today, were written before this 1925 watershed moment, or supposed watershed moment, right? Suggesting that the kinds of questions that came to a rather controversial head with the Abdul Razik affair were areas of concern well before he published his book. So some 4 or 5 years earlier, the important writer Ahmed Amin published the Kitab al-Akhlaq, a book on ethics, that was incorporated into the curriculum of secondary schools and was also taught to teachers of primary schools. This was part of a flowering interest in ethics in Egypt that started at least at about the turn of the century, and included publishing old Islamic classics, translations of contemporary European writers, and a retranslation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics by Ahmed Lutfi as-Sayyid. Amin had been educated at the Azhar and the College for Sharia Judges, and taught at both the college and the Egyptian University. He is identified most strongly, though, with his affinity with liberal circles, best known for a work examining the history of Islam, which stressed its rationalist side. In the Kitab al-Akhlaq, too, Amin's liberal side is on rather clear display. So the book is centered, as one might expect of a book of ethics, on the twin concepts of good and evil. But, says Amin, determining what is good and what is evil requires a standard by which we make these judgments. Just as when we say something is tall or short, we use the unit of the meter as a yardstick, or when we say something is heavy or light, we use, or at least the Egyptians did, the unit of the uqqa or the raql. These are all kind of weights. So must we have some sort of measure against which the valuations that truthfulness is good or lying is evil can make any sense. Amin lays out 3 rather general schools, what he calls madahib, that give different answers to this question. So the first answer is personal happiness. This is the egoism, or what he calls the egoistic hedonism, in which he pulls together Epicurus from the ancients and Hobbes from the moderns. The second is general happiness, by which he means the utilitarianism of Bentham and Mill. And the last is what he calls intuition, in which things are good or evil for intrinsic reasons or for attaining virtue. Here he has in mind the Stoics among the ancients and Kant from among the moderns. So this is, as you can tell, a kind of general survey, perhaps an imprecise survey. After providing an overview of each, Amin sides with the version of the last school, what he calls intuition. He cannot accept the notion that ethics can be reduced to pleasure and pain, or a ledger that balances positive and negative consequences, deeming this the behavior of merchants. Rather, he says, it is the case that, quote, man was born such that contained in his depths is a faculty that shows him that some actions are good and others are bad, not by virtue of their effects in producing pleasure or pain, but rather in and of themselves. This is the conscience, and Amin devotes a standalone chapter to explaining to his young Egyptian audience what this conscience is. Rather than provide a detailed account of this chapter, I want to instead bring your attention to a few salient themes that I hope will help us understand his project better. The first is his discussions relative to autonomy from religion and tradition. Islam and Christianity enter into the picture as part of Amin's justification for why he cannot accept consequentialist accounts of ethics, because the charity, ihsan, altruism, ithar, and sacrifice spoken about plainly by the two religions cannot be properly understood as virtues in consequentialist readings. But for a thinker who was preoccupied throughout much of his life with providing a rereading of early Islamic history, and especially in a work that is meant to educate young students, it is remarkable that otherwise references to religious traditions are vanishingly few. Amin's progressivism, in the form of a suspicion of tradition and custom as ethical guides, is on full display. Interestingly, he uses for tradition or for custom the word urf here, which has been, which is interesting because it's been mobilized today to afford some ethical distance from the textuality of scripture. Whereas here he's kind of assimilating it to scripture and religion and tradition. Oddbjorn Leirvik from the University of Oslo has commented on how the notion of a supreme ideal, al-mathal al-a'la, used by later writers to insert what he calls Quranic God talk into the equation, is not used for that purpose by Amin, who instead, quote, rather speaks empirically of the different supreme ideals that guide the peoples of the earth. As Safran has also mentioned, Amin is one of a group of progressivist scholars who, quote, rejected any notion of ethics as founded on positive divine revelation and any idea of superhuman or otherworldly sanction, and relied rather on the individual conscience, social responsibility, or the sanction of society to provide the necessary support for ethical norms. There is also Amin's choice, sort of under this heading of religion and tradition, also his choice of reference and terms. So whereas it would be quite possible to think about ethics by turning to classical Islamic schools of theology, these seem to make no appearance in Amin's work. Rather than husn and qubh, right, Arabic terms for good and evil, that would have been an obvious point of reference, given that they dominated the extensive and detailed jurisprudential discussions of moral philosophy for centuries, Amin uses the alternative Arabic terms khair and shar, which also translate to good and evil. Even more remarkably, though, the loaded terms ta'a and isyan, disobedience and obedience, which are used throughout the Quran to talk about one's relationship to God. So, for example, when Satan disobeys God, he performs isyan, he does isyan. These are reserved for talking about the moral agent's relationship not to God, but to his conscience and to the laws also of civilized society. The second theme that I'd like to address is Amin's sources for thinking about conscience. This is not to belabor his debt to European thinkers, but rather to understand better his rather eclectic understanding of conscience when viewed from the perspective of Europe. Leirvik has commented on Egyptian writers' extensive engagement with Rousseau, going back as far as Rifat al-Tahtawi in the first half of the 19th century. And indeed, in Amin's understanding of conscience, there are echoes of Rousseau, who thought of conscience as a moral guide and restraint. Amin explains how a conscience functions temporally, before a moral act, during it, and after it. In the before phase, he uses the words hadi and murshid, so guides, explicitly, to refer to the element of a conscience that warns the moral agent from doing evil and tries to restrain him, or commands the performance of obligations and encourages him to continue that performance. But conscience is also a judge, the word qadi, and an enforcer of the judgment, a formulation that might fit better with Kant's understanding of conscience as an inner court present within humans. This takes us away from Rousseau's focus on sentiment and feeling and towards a Kantian focus on judgment. Amin uses the Arabic for judgment, hukum, that is applied also to court rulings. Finally, though Amin thinks of conscience as a natural faculty that exists in young children and even in animals, it is not an innate source of goodness imperiled by the danger of a corrupt society that will obscure it, as suggested by Rousseau. Though Amin shares Rousseau's interest in moral education, he does not share the French philosopher's suspicion of society. For him, a good conscience is not one that uncovers that original pristine state despite societal influences, but neither is it merely a reflection of society's prejudices as maintained by, for example, Montaigne and Hobbes. Rather, conscience for Amin is a natural faculty that grows and becomes more refined when proper attention is paid to it. It is in need of education or moral development. It can err, especially when it is immature, and it can become weak or sick or even die. But when it is properly developed through repeatedly following its imperatives, keeping the company of good people, and reading books that enjoin virtue, it can also be strengthened. Along with education and a strong will, then, societal experience is an essential element of a healthy conscience. To think in terms of sources, then, this is reminiscent more of the virtue ethics that was an integral part of Islamic ethical thought, which stresses repetition and habituating oneself towards the demands of virtue, rather than, as Amin says, quote, accustoming oneself to evil by repeatedly placing evil before the soul. The third theme I want to point out very quickly is the important link between conscience and nation building, especially as it applies to what we may call civilization talk. Just as the conscience varies within the life of an individual, it can vary by time and place. There is a hint of Amin's progressivism on display when he suggests that one of the accomplishments of the modern period has been to minimize interreligious disputes between Muslims and Christians in Egypt, thanks to a new, more correct understanding of what conscience demands. More obvious, however, is his claim that the imperatives of conscience are rather simple in primitive states, or you might understand this as a state of nature, but in civilized states, in which people follow laws of society that in turn help him live a life of conscience and increase its authority, the conscience will be refined to a point such that individuals give entirely of themselves in defense of their opinions and in the path of the reform of their nation. The final point I want to bring your attention to is Amin's very strong defense of freedom of conscience. Even though conscience differs from place to place and time to time, and even though conscience is not infallible, every person is nonetheless bound to obey his or her conscience. He is bound to obey what he believes to be right, not what is correct in reality. If he is proven to be wrong, he bears no ethical responsibility, because his obligation is to follow his conscience. This, needless to say, is a remarkably individualist notion of the human person. I turn now to my second figure and his understanding of the term religion. This is someone who's not quite as well known, but someone who I've worked on for some time. Muhammad Bakhit al-Muti'i was the Mufti of Egypt for a spell in the 19-teens, and a senior religious scholar at the Azhar, a rather prominent religious scholar at the Azhar. When Abdul Razik, who we met at the beginning of my talk, published his controversial work, one of his most vocal critics was Bakhit himself, who not only served on the council that revoked the former's credentials, identifying him as a member of scholarly officialdom, but also Bakhit wrote a lengthy rejoinder to the arguments advanced in his book. It is evident from that response that in the immediate aftermath of the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate, Bakhit, like his colleagues, was severely opposed to the hard political secularism that denied a role for Islamic normativity in affairs of state. Despite this, however, I hope to show that Bakhit was not untouched by the intellectual currents of the period, including a certain type of Muslim secularity. So scholars of secularism have in recent years opened up important new avenues for allowing us to think in deeper and more expansive ways about the secular that go far beyond the formulaic separation of religion and state. Among the most important of these has been the insistence of the anthropologist Talal Asad that the secular emerged together alongside a certain conception of religion as Siamese twins, mutually constitutive elements reflecting a modern reconfiguration of power. For Asad, the powers of the secular function to create a new understanding of religion as an abstract form or essence, which transcended more particular forms of life. A similar argument is sketched out by Charles Taylor in his monumental A Secular Age. Following up these contributions with an eye to the global, Jose Casanova has observed that one of the most important political trends has been, quote, the globalization of the category of religion itself, and of the binary classification of reality, religious, secular, that it entails. Looking to Bakhit allows us to better understand these developments as they unfolded in the context of Egyptian society. In the fall of 1910, the Khadib of Egypt, Abbas Hilmi II, received a telegram from Aswan in Upper Egypt, informing him that a local judge had authenticated a testimony claiming that the crescent had been sighted, signaling the end of the fasting month of Ramadan. The Khadib in turn sent word to Bakhit, then head of the Sharia court in Alexandria, asking him for his learned opinion on the appropriateness of acting upon a religious report that was transmitted by the telegraph. Bakhit responded that it should indeed be acted upon across Egypt and subsequently wrote a treatise justifying his position. As we will see, his argumentation in this work permits us a window through which to better understand the changing connotations of the term deen, which is usually translated as religion. In particular, placing Bakhit's text within the context of the preceding Hanafi legal school to which he belonged reveals a remarkable shift from a complex notion of deen in the pre-modern period, as understood in terms of both transcendent and immanent concerns, so both of them, to one which Bakhit understands exclusively in terms of transcendence. But in order to understand how this shift occurs in the thought world of Islamic law, it is important to take a step back and think about an intriguing distinction made by some pre-modern Muslim jurists, in particular those who are associated with this Hanafi legal school. So virtually any conveying, virtually any conveying of a message is classified in fiqh works or Islamic law works as a report, a khabar. The two major subdivisions subsumed by this category are, on the one hand, narrations, the preeminent exemplars of which are the prophetic traditions, famously known as hadith, and, on the other hand, in-court testimonies, shahadat, which in a legal system that was, at least in theory, suspicious of written documentation, encompass much of the proceedings of a court, statements by witnesses, but also confessions, claims, advisory opinions known as fatwas, and even legal verdicts themselves. These two subtypes were mutually exclusive and were often set off against one another as opposites. In the Hanafi school, however, these two types did not exhaust the set of khabars, the reports. There existed also a little used hybrid category, which was thought not to be adequately captured by either of the first two, though it resembled, this is the word that gets used, resembled both of them in certain aspects. This is the category in which we find the umur diniya, the religious matters, which I want to focus on to think about religion. The most prominent example of which was a claim by an individual that he or she had cited the new moon as signaled the onset of the month of Ramadan. Pre-modern Hanafi jurists envisioned the Ramadan case as being a religious matter, which participated in each of the two main subcategories discussed above, so because it was a hybrid. It was a narration in that it demanded a certain moral probity of the narrators involved, and it was a testimony insofar as the entire process was regulated through the legal authority of courts. The claim was to be presented before a judge, who was authorized to assess and pronounce on its validity. So, at least in the Hanafi school, the role of the judge was central and could only be sidestepped in exceptional cases. Deeming the sighting of the Ramadan moon a religious matter incorporates two important semantic ranges of the term deen. On the one hand, pre-modern dictionaries prominently included words for a legal judgment, ruling, or sentence, al-qada, al-hukm, under deen. This, as Wilfred Cantwell Smith has pointed out, is an ancient Semitic root with a long history in the Middle East, but at the same time, deen is also connected to the notion of proper conduct, obedience, or ritual worship, ibadah. Thus, the connection between the sighting of the new moon and the initiation of the ritual act of fasting means that the former, the sighting of the new moon, can easily be subsumed under the meaning of deen as pertaining to ritual worship. On this reading, the umur diniya, the religious matters, could be understood as being oriented towards God and the afterlife. The technical term diyana, derived from the same root as deen, was often explained by the phrase, that which is between man and God. But deen, on this formulation, the religious matters, was not quite conceptualized in terms of the religion-secular dichotomy with which we are familiar. Even as it was oriented or directed towards the other world, it did not exclude involvement with this world. This explains why, importantly, the characterization of the Ramadan moon sighting as one of the umur diniya was not understood by Hanafis as a reason to exclude it from the mundane regulation of the courts. So, for example, long before the telegraph, reports of sightings that traveled from one jurisdiction to another were overseen by the regulating authority of the courts and structured around in-court testimonies. Indeed, for Hanafis, the meanings for deen that signify legal process and judgment, al-qada, seem to be no less a constituent element of what was nonetheless considered a religious matter. Because of their hybrid resemblance to both narrations and testimonies, the Umur Dini on this older formulation were no less concerned with the materiality of human life as they were with the other world. But by the time Bakhit revisited this question in 1910, however, circumstances had changed considerably. In addition to political changes and reconfigurations of the court system that separated the jurisdiction of the Sharia concerns from other civil, criminal, and commercial cases, there was also a new way of thinking about what religion was. As Abdul Qadir Tayyab has argued, for Egyptian modernists like Jamaluddin al-Afghani, who were engaged in refuting materialism, religion came to be understood as the antithesis of naturalism. Its essence lay in the existence of a higher reality. Charles Taylor has commented that the obviousness of the distinction between the natural and supernatural, or immanent and transcendent, is a peculiar feature of modern life, what he calls a constitutive dimension of modern experience. For figures like Afghani, religion was coming to be understood increasingly as that which pertains to a transcendent realm, conceptually distinct from nature. But it was not just modernists like Afghani who understood religion in this way. Bakhit did too, as this text reveals. When it comes to his intervention in the case of the moon sighting controversy, Bakhit's contribution is to eliminate altogether the insistent Hanafi concern with court procedure. Importantly, this shift is made necessary, and not just possible, because of the underlying transformation in the very conception of deen itself. Bakhit is himself rather clear on this point. New moon sightings are religious reports. Thus they resemble the narration, riwayah, and so it is impossible that any of them are subject to the Qadi's judgment. Notably, it is precisely the description of the reports as being religious that now disqualifies them from the Qadi's regulatory control, a sharp departure from the prevailing Hanafi tradition. Whereas his predecessors thought religious matters resembled both the narration and the testimony, and had a difficult time imagining that such reports could have any standing independent of the validating authority of the Qadis, Bakhit finds this a nonsensical proposition. For him, the central criteria to be considered is not the integrity of the procedural mechanisms which had defined Hanafi thinking on the issue for so long, but rather the truth content of the report itself. This significantly is a secularizing move that removes us from a primary occupation with the mediation of the courts and the materiality and authority of the bodies that inhabit them towards the abstract realm of individual minds. Thanks. I don't know what to do with it. Importantly, this cognitive turn is thought to be justified and indeed commonsensical, simply because the reports in question have traditionally been labeled diniya, a descriptor which has come to have a new meaning in a new age. In effect, the previously distinct category of the Umur Diniya has been assimilated entirely, this is what I should have done it, has been assimilated entirely to the category of narrations precisely because the former are religious matters, and so opposed in this binary scheme to the worldly concerns of testimonies. To be religious is not now only to be ritualistically oriented towards the transcendent, but also to be separate from the world, and so governed by a logic that properly belongs to the realm of the transcendent. It is telling that this argument proceeds in the context of a discussion about how to handle the telegraph. Bakhit's response to the question that motivated his book is to imagine the telegraph as an inert medium, which does not impinge on the truth value of the report. In terms of validity, telegraph reports are for him identical with in-person spoken communication, the medium for long, exclusively favored by Islamic law. Timothy Mitchell has commented that in the 19th century, the telegraph came to be the paradigmatic symbol of a new ontology, the one we encountered earlier, which distinguished not only between body and mind, but also introduced a third layer, a metaphysical realm of meaning having an ideal existence to which symbols in the mind pointed or referred, or more properly, which it represented. Mitchell references the philologist Michel Brial of the Collège de France, who notes approvingly that, quote, words are signs. They have no other existence than the signals of the wireless telegraph. It is noteworthy that Bakhit should think religious reports, by virtue of their being religious, belong properly to this model. The idea of an ideal realm, an abstract essence outside of the world, fits well with the conception of religion I have been discussing above. I'll skip that. Religious matters then came to represent for Bakhit precisely those issues that, like telegraph reports, transcended materiality. They were ineligible for adjudication and regulation by courts and unperturbed by their relationship to the world. They came to be conceived by their very nature as abstractions, whose locus was the mind of private individuals, and so the private religious sphere of society in general. They are no longer concerned with law, but rather ethics, which, Asad has pointed out, are, quote, a matter of following one's conscience, not of obeying externally given commands. The individual, private character of ethical decisions must, Asad goes on, stand free equally of the power of the state and the demands of one's community. So very briefly, by way of conclusion, let me draw your attention once more to the two very different figures that I've gathered together in this paper. Despite the divergence in their intellectual training, genre of writing, and scholarly agendas, I've tried to argue here they were confronting an intellectual and political context which brought to the fore shared concerns. Turning our attention away from the famous controversies such as the acceptance of Abdul-Razak's bombshell work, and towards these intellectual developments instead helps us better understand the deep societal significance of these questions in a changing world. By juxtaposing these two very different figures, I've tried to outline in a rather preliminary way a noticeable shift in Egyptian Muslim thinking towards a more thoroughgoing notion of the human as an individual, capable of independent ethical evaluation, and with more tenuous relations to external powers. Thank you.
Thank you both. We will now open the floor for questions, but I was actually wondering if both of you would like to somehow engage in a dialogue with each other's paper before, so we give the audience a couple of minutes to think about possible questions. So your engagement is, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot here, and I think in Kamran's paper, and I think it's a convincing case. I guess one question, I mean, I can just phrase it as a question rather than a discussion point, is whether you can clarify a little bit more, because, I mean, as I heard what you were saying, and as I was actually thinking about my own paper in that context, liberalism seems to kind of be a common frame, right? Or at least hovering in the background in some way. And I think you make it very explicit right at the beginning, very explicit reference to it. So, yeah, I wonder if you can clarify it or, extend a little bit thinking about what work that liberalism is doing in the paper, and like how you're trying to relate them together.
Yes. So I think what I was trying to do was say we have you have these studies by on freedom, by what's his name, Bernard Lewis, and you have Hans Rosenthal about freedom in the pre-modern, and then you have these papers that talk about liberalism in Tahtawi's thinking by like McLerney, whose paper I sent you, and this is what. So the idea is that there's some key terms here that are being analyzed, and frequently it's about importation from Europe. It's about translation. It's about moving away from traditions and stuff like that. And on the other hand, there's talk terms, but the analyses of but where does this come from? So the idea is that it comes from exposure to European literature and translation, and it comes from also new education. But the question is whether or not that type of analysis is perhaps a bit too divorced from the idea of sovereignty and the techniques of the sort of disciplinary techniques that were also coming around the same time. And shouldn't we try to join these two into a more compelling discussion. That's what I meant. I'm not sure if that's what I meant. I'm not sure if that's what it sounded like.
All right. Are there questions from the floor? Please.
Thank you very much for a fascinating insight into an area that has been rather obscure. If I understood you correctly, you suggest that Muhammad Ali took a different view or a new novel view of building a new nation and gave particular attention to health issues or biological issues and so on. How did that happen? Can you give more information or detail? How did he come to that, or what sort of influence came on him? This is extremely important because in Egypt, it is regarded Muhammad Ali is the big builder of modern Egyptian state. And this theory is of great significance in understanding modern state. Thank you.
I think that in the secondary literature on Muhammad Ali, I'm not a specialist in Muhammad Ali by any means. It's generally thought that so Muhammad Ali was illiterate. He was illiterate. He was born in Albania, and he couldn't read or write. And he joined the army early on in his career. I think he was 15 or something like that. And he came to Egypt as sort of like a soldier of fortune almost. So I don't think that it was his exposure to the latest cutting-edge European ideas of philosophy and medicine, perhaps only in reports that he hears from people around him, but he couldn't read, so it wouldn't have been his reading. And he wouldn't have had a huge number of, early on at least, he wouldn't have had a huge number of advisors who were equally well placed to learn this. It seems that what is more likely was that he was there. He was obviously intelligent, and he recognized that the military was, if nothing else, the most important aspect of his desire to centralize power. It seems that this desire for power was sort of an overarching theme in his life, and he recognized that the military and played a crucial element in that, in his desire for achieving this. So I think, and that's the view that Fahmy. This is why Khalid Fahmy has written his book, as far as I know, is that he believes that the military was the sort of the end for which that drove reform in Muhammad Ali's mind. So the establishment of institutions and education and many of these things were for the sake of making a large and successful army. Yeah. So I don't want to say that it was a mistake or that he just did it accidentally, because that would be silly. But it seems that at least it seems that the military was really the most important driving force behind his. Yeah.
May I just take it to Quadri, if I may?
Yeah.
I mean, would you consider the effects of the French campaign that preceded him directly of influence in that regard? Because he just came after
He did,
the end of the French Revolution has the French campaign in Egypt, although it lasted only 3 years, had magnificent and far-reaching effects on Egyptian society in this day.
I think that's what people like Bernard. Well, I think it's possible to argue that, but it was so short, and the actual impact on Egyptian society was, well, if maybe it was huge, but it wasn't very lasting as far as I know. So they made some land reforms, and they left a small mission of scientists. But what other direct, like sort of evidence for influence is not clear to me. And it's also unclear to what extent Muhammad Ali was aware of these things. So the texts that record the events, there's 3 or 4 texts, I think. Aside from Jabarti, there's a few others, right? And they're not terribly clear on what exactly was happening, right? And sometimes that one copies from the other. So it's difficult for me to I find it hard to believe that that he would have somehow read or heard about the French, Napoleon, the French, and that would have driven him to do all of these types of things. What seems possibly more likely that he was in that he was in a position in the main cities of Egypt where there was lots of circulation of Europeans and ideas were flowing, and it may have, that he was keen enough to realize that he wanted to get good European military men, and that it was this desire and this sort of advice that he was given that would have directed him to make these particular types of reform. And I think a lot of it was just sort of ad hoc at the time. I'm not sure how much of a clear vision he had even of what he had, his historical.
So before asking for other questions, I was wondering if when you look at conscience, right, that is so central in the articulation of your paper, if you feel any connection to the kind of work that has been done on not just medical textbooks, but the translation of other hard sciences in the previous century, because somehow the Ahmed Amin was brought up in the new establishment for the training of Shari judges, actually showing that judges no longer were Shari. You had to say that they were Shari to identify them as Shari. But so sort of like a mixed form of education for them. So do you think so how do you see the relation between the scholars that you looked at and the trickling in of those texts into the general curriculum, both in the religious sciences and outside of it?
So that's a good question. I mean, I don't see. I've not looked at all of these texts, right? In fact, the conscience element of the paper, the conscience half of the paper, is something that's rather new. But to the extent that I've looked at these texts, I don't see evidence of that sort. But of course, as you sort of pointed out, there's lots of indications of some. I mean, as one of the other things that I think that we have in common here is that we're thinking about how these specific terms find their way. So that general, find their way into Arabic language and their Arabic thought. So that general sort of culture of education, as you're pointing out, right, is possible. But so the way I'm understanding what you're saying, Kamran, these sound themselves to be rather specialized texts, right? So I don't know that someone who goes to the Azhar, like Amin did, is necessarily going to be exposed to them.
No.
But in this kind of more broader, general way, in which people are living in a culture in which they are constantly being exposed to and navigating between different cultural, different intellectual traditions, different educational trajectories, different segments of society which have their own sorts of formation. I think that to some extent is, where there's a commonality, and the kind of commonality that becomes so much more acute in the 20th century because there's, at least a century, perhaps more, at least a century of this, general orientation.
The lifespan of these texts, they started publishing in 1832, and they stopped publishing the medical texts, I think, certainly before 1882. because after 1882, the English changed the language of medicine education to English, and that ended. So this was a rare. This is a large corpus of texts, in which Arabic is made to bend over backwards, and it's made to do things that it's never done before. It's incredible, because what authors are doing is they're taking the canon, I believe, and they're trying to modify it so that it fits into these French medical textbooks. So, but it's unclear to me. They were published at least in 1869, 1870. I think there's Bulaq editions of these medical texts. But to what extent they were used outside of Abu Za'ab al-Qasr al-Aini is not clear to me, right? They might have been influential so you have these these newspapers and like dailies or weeklies or whatever, like Muqtataf, and it may be that early on these types of ideas that they were reading these types of text, possibly, and that would have had a trickle down effect.
Yeah, but so why are you confining the impact of the text to the readership of the text?
What I'm trying to say is that I don't want to overstress the influence that I claim that these medical texts have, and so I want to be a little bit careful about saying that. What I don't want to say is, these medical texts propound a wholly new idea of sovereignty, and therefore they are like evidence of something new happening. I think that would be very dangerous, because it may be that they were written and no one ever read them.
But that even
they weren't even used, but they might have not even been used by lexicographers afterwards, right? And in which case they're non-entities. Right? So what I want to say is that these are there, and they haven't been studied at all, as far as I know, except briefly by Fahmi a little bit. So wouldn't it be interesting to explore these texts a little bit more, and to see how far it goes, and to see what sort of readership they might have had, whether or not they're ever cited in these newspapers, for example, in which case we're able to establish the possibility that they were used by lexicographers and would have been influential on the creation of medical lexicon. So a medical lexicon was developed, a large one was developed during the same time, but whether or not it was used after the English closed the Arabic medical school is difficult to say, or
But this language thing is interesting, actually,
exactly,
because
and it's a solid 5 decades.
Right. Well,
it's a very valuable 50 years. Yeah.
Right, but actually, so some of the material that I've been looking at, which are not medicine, which I know nothing about, but science more broadly, astronomy, and you brought up Muqtataf, which is interesting because. So one of the texts that I've worked with in a different part of this project is an astronomy text, which is kind of a modern astronomy text, which is an 1880s text, actually, right? So this move away from Arabic to English, there's also a move in this, the kind of opposite translation happening, in which, English texts are, Americans, in particular Protestant Americans in particular, are translating these new modern astronomic works, and there's all sorts of geological works, I think, and also, there may be others too that I'm less familiar with, in about this period, into Arabic, and that they're being actually made available as textbooks, and not so dissimilar from what, I think yours was a textbook as well, one of them.
It was a textbook, yeah.
Right.
All of these were textbooks at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of interesting shift happening at that time too, to make scientific learning much more accessible. So, but that's just a side note.
Any other questions? So we have 2. Can we? Yeah.
Somewhere you talked about hopes and view of society, you see. I don't know, we are comparing with what, you see, the hopes and view of medical sort of thing, or that you mentioned,
Yes.
and I didn't understand that.
Oh, right. So Hobbes has this famous idea so there is a social contract theory, right, that the reason why humans form communities, or how they do it, is that they basically agree to enter into a contract with someone, the sovereign, in which he, so that they give him their, their service, and he gives them protection. Right? So that's the very broad idea of social contract theory. So the question is the reasons why people would do that in the first place. So Hobbes's idea was that the reason why people would do that is that people are a bunch of animals, and they're completely in thrall of their appetites, and they will run after each other and try to take violent and uninhibitedly. So because recognizing that sort of brutish nature in humans, they are at least able to agree with the sovereign. They give him virtual omnipotent power over them, and he agrees to protect them from this type of, from being basically this violence. So the reason why it's relevant is that this Al-Marsafi, who was writing in 1880, so he published it, 1881, so right in the thick of the Arabi revolution, or whatever it's called, he seems to believe that humans go, that that's where sovereignty comes from, essentially. It's a power that arises because people need to protect each other from this violence, and the idea was that this is totally different from the reasons why political communities formed according to pre-modern Islamic political philosophers. And so that I find is striking. It's one of the most striking things, actually. It's also, I think, one of the clearest. So, Al-Marsafi is, he's got hadith, he's got Quran in his text, he's got narrations by all sorts of people. And at basis, however, is something that has very little to do with the Islamic tradition itself, as it unfolded over time. And has much more to do with Hobbes, right? Or someone else. So that was the idea. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for these very interesting papers. My question is for the second presenter. So I think you contextualized Bucket's ideas and reading of what religion is, or what his reformulation of the concept of being very well. And you really showed how he had also this shared concerns of the time, like his more modernist or more secularly oriented equivalents, sort of. But I'm not sure whether the concept of Muslim secularity really captures his position.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering whether you could elaborate more why you think that Muslim secularity really should be the framework through which we should read his ideas of deen, or his new ideas of what deen is or what religious is.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So I think one of the things that I want to do is sort of disaggregate what we mean, and so that's why I don't use the word secularism, or I don't use it in this context that you're mentioning. So disaggregate what we mean about when we talk about secularism, and so elements of that could be referred to in a kind of looser way or weaker way as secularity. But those elements would include, the kind of typical political secularism that we understand, that's kind of institutional secularism. It's also used to refer, this is, other people's work, not just my own thinking, could also be used to refer to kind of declining notions of religion, right? But then, so Taylor has a kind of third idea, which is thinking about secularism, or one understanding of secularism, as trying to untangle the kinds of what he calls the contexts of understanding, right? The kind of general intellectual contexts that make us think in ways that we might identify as secular in one of these more stronger versions, right? And one of the things, I'm bringing together, a few people here, but one of the things that comes, that people have pointed to is that this notion of religion is always accompanied by a notion of something that's secular, right? So if religion is something that's secular, or something as well. So that kind of idea of secularity is always sort of, so if I'm kind of going, tracking what is meant by religion, then there's always accompanying, shadowing notion of secularity, or the secular that is also being tracked, even if it's not being tracked explicitly. So that's sort of, I'm not sure if that helps, but that's sort of what I'm getting at, what I mean.
Yeah. I understand your starting point.
Yes, okay.
But can we also trace that secularity in Wahid's analysis or writings or ideas? I understand the way he changed the way, religious scholars look at what din is or what religious is, but has he himself elaborated on this idea of secularity? Or is it that you attribute, you see what I mean?
Yes, no, it's my analysis.
Of that secularity.
Yes, no, that's right. I mean, I'd be interested to if you think it's kind of an inappropriate usage, but it is my analysis, right? So it is my analysis so the only kind of explicit statements he has about secularity is this response to Abdurrazik, in which, he's kind of sees as very clear, Almani, very, strong secularism that is irreligious and so on, right? But I'm sort of putting that question to the side, right? Because that question, but no, the word secularity is also not, crucial, I think, to the analysis, but I think it's part of it, and this is part of my analysis. It's not a word that he would use, certainly. And in fact, the analysis of changing in deen is something that, of course, he is not making explicit either, right? He is simply pointing out, right? I mean, this is, I think, to understand this, I think one of the things that I try to do, and maybe in the larger version that hopefully anyways it's a little bit more evident, is to kind of try to place that understanding of deen within a larger tradition from which he's departed. And so, he doesn't come out and say, I'm specifically understanding this in an entirely different way than my predecessors have, but nonetheless, I think part of that work is trying to put it into a context in which to sort of track those shifts.
So my suggestion was not that, it is totally inappropriate. I think if I borrow, I can borrow the first presenter's argument, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That was my point. And I think we should be rather reluctant or very careful
Copyright.
applying these concepts in such kind of.
But I mean, do you feel that sort of tracking this kind of change in religion that I'm trying to argue for also entails a certain kind of idea about secularity?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, but I think that's the argument.
Yeah.
You wanted to respond?
I just thought that what you meant by was it Muslim secularity? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Although I thought that what he supported was that it was a Muslim secularity in the sense that he moves the idea of the he uses the word deen in a sense that reifies it and makes it it moves it into a particular realm that's reified away from its originally social context, which was the courts. And I think that's what I thought you meant by that phrase.
Yes,
Maybe I got that wrong.
That's right. So that's the kind of...
Does that make sense? I'm explaining. Yeah. Okay. That's better.
You have a question?
Yeah, no comment on.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a scholar, but I think a lot of these scholars' achievements were, you can argue, they were common sense, more than being just exposed to modern or European thoughts on secularism. These were essentially religious figures following the prevailing religious dictates and working their minds through them and sometimes reaching secular conclusions by common sense. That's my thinking.
If I have, if I may, as Gramscian, common sense is precisely, I think, what two papers were trying to show. That is, how certain things have become common sense. So I think that that's also one of the connecting reasons why these two papers are not just juxtaposed in this workshop, but rather they speak to each other also on this level. So before thanking the speakers, let me remind you of the next and final event of the dialogue series, which will be in a month on November 16th. From 19th and early 20th century Egypt, we jump back into the actuality, and we have a seminar on governance and academic freedom in Turkey and Hungary. And it will be here at 6 p.m. Also, for those of you, well, let me thank our marketing and outreach team, because if you actually made it here, it means that probably she has reached you. So if she has reached you and you haven't, you are not subscribed to our mailing list, please leave us your details. I cannot but thank the speakers for coming all the way here and illuminating us on these two very key marginal aspects of governance that are actually at the very heart of it. So the marginality and the heart are both elements of the human body and medicine. But thank you very much both, and please join me in thanking them.